हरि करना।
So with the addition rules for probability, we have answered one of your question saying what is the chances of occurring this or that event or that or this event. So that was answered. The way of calculation dependent on whether the respective events where you want to calculate where you want to estimate the chances, if they are mutually exclusive, that's a different case. If they are not mutually exclusive, that's a different case. Okay, so now the second question comes. There is a second question. You normally human also thinks in such a way that okay, so what is the chances of occurring this event and that event, or that event and this event? What's the chance? That's answered by multiplication rules for probability. So the multiplication rules for probability are a set of principles used to calculate the probability of two or more events occurring simultaneously. There are two main rules. One is multiplication rule for independent events. Second one is multiplication rule for dependent event. So first we will look into the independent event. Let's take it in this way. Two events A and B are independent events if the fact that A occurs does not affect the probability of B occurring. That's what we call it as independent. If A occurring affects the probability of B occurring, then we call it as a dependent. First, let's see the multiplication rule for independent events. Okay, multiplication rule for independent event. So multiplication rule for independent events, if two events A and B are independent, meaning that the occurrence of one does not affect the probability of the other occurring, then the probability of both A and B occurring is the product of their individual probabilities. Because what you want to know? You want to know probability of this and that. Correct, na? You want to know probability of happening both at a time. At a time. So at a time means you have to go for the multiplication. Because you want to know what's the probability of this and that. This and that. It's not this or that. If this or that means that's okay. Even that happens, that's fine, or this also fine. But you want both. You want both. There, this or that event, A or B event, either of them is okay for you. Either of them is okay for you. That's the reason we have done the summation. But here you want both. Both means both. So in that case, we have gone for the multiplication. So then if they are independent, then P of A and B is equal to P of A multiplied by P of B. That's it. So for example, the probability of flipping a coin and rolling a die and getting a 2 on the die and heads on the coin, assuming a fair coin and the fair die, obviously there is no dependency between these two events, because one is flipping a coin, other one is die. There is not at all a dependency. So probability of A is equals to 1 divided by 2. Probability of die, that's B. I'll put it as B, or you can put it as die, and this one as coin, and toss, it's equals to again 1 divided by 6. Then probability of both A and B is equals to 1 divided by 2 multiplied by 1 divided by 6, and it's obviously 1 divided by 12. That's it. So probability of let me just a second. Okay, so that's how if the events are independent, and that's how we calculate the probability of A and B happening. Then the second one, multiplication rule for dependent events. So multiplication rule for dependent events: if two events capital A and capital B are dependent on each other, dependent meaning that the occurrence of the one affects the probability of the other occurring, then the probability of both A and B occurring is the product of the probability of A given that B has occurred the probability of B. Let me put it here. So probability of A and B is dependent on A. Okay, so then probability of A multiplied by probability of first one, the probability of both A and B is equals to probability of A times, let's say, probability of B, probability of occurring of B dependent on probability of A. In that case, we will write it down as a probability of B given that, we say that probability of B, and then we put an vertical bar or a forward slash. That means given that. It says given that B has occurred. Okay. So in this case, A has occurred. So I'm just repeating this. For probability of A and B where B is dependent on A occurring, then probability of A multiplied by probability of B given that A, capital A has occurred. Okay, clear? So probability of A and B when B is dependent on probability of B dependent on occurring of A. Okay, if one is occurrence, like meaning if two events A and B are dependent, meaning that the occurrence of one affects the probability of the other occurring. So then the probability of A and B is equal to the probability of A multiplied by probability of B given that A has occurred. That's it. So this is what is called here the probability B occurs only after A occurring. Okay, that's what is called a dependent. That's what we call dependent events, and this rule is for multiplication rule for dependent events. So if you want to take an example, the probability of here, where probability of B vertical bar A denotes the conditional probability of B given that A has occurred. Probability of B given that A has occurred. Now a small example. For example, the probability of drawing a king. Probability of drawing a king from a standard deck of cards and then drawing another king, obviously without replacement. Obviously without replacement. So here answer for this is probability of king and the king. King and then king is equal to probability of king on the first draw. Probability of king on the first draw multiplied by probability of king on the second draw, given that a king was already drawn. King was already drawn on the first draw. So it's obviously 4 divided by 52 multiplied by 3. Obviously 1, after removing 1 you will have you can have only 3 kings, and after removing 1 you will have only your sample space will reduce to 51. So it's 1 divided by 221. So this is what the multiplication rule for probability, where you want to know what's the chance of happening this event and that event. But you should also be careful about whether those events are dependent or independent. If they are independent, simply multiply them. If they are dependent, then you have to do more than that.